The Battle of the Coral Sea is the only known Navy battle in the history of warfare, where the two sides did not see each other. No American sailor saw a Japanese ship. No Japanese sailor saw an American ship. They fought partly by radar instrument, which was not all that accurate in those days. They fought by instrument. They fought it mostly at night. But the Battle of Coral Sea, when it was over, the United States retreated, heading back to Australia, but the Japanese Navy was so badly damaged that they realized, hey, we cannot continue to go to Australia. We can't fight like this. So they turned back. But it was a victory for the Japanese. Now then, the Japanese decided to invade the United States, and they got to some islands called Midway. I wish you had more time. I've studied the Battle of Midway. Essentially what happened was, we lucked out. The ball took a bounce in our favor there at Midway. We were pretty well defeated, and our airplanes could not find the Japanese aircraft carriers, and finally our airplanes were running out of fuel, so we had to return to base. Whoops. But right below them, as they turned around, right below them was the Japanese fleet. So our men started dropping bombs. Of course, when they dropped the bombs, that meant they could fly farther because the planes were lighter. So they dropped the bombs on the Japanese fleet there, the aircraft carriers, destroyed several of the Japanese aircraft carriers. Then, of course, the planes flew back to Midway Island, landed, and refueled. In the meantime, they saw these Japanese planes coming at them. The Japanese planes radioed that they had to surrender. They were out of fuel and they had nowhere to land. Their aircraft carriers having been destroyed. The runways on the aircraft carriers. So the Japanese airpods landed, and of course their planes were taken and they were put in prison camps. Midway was the first big victory that the Americans had in World War II, and it occurred in May, approximately 6 months, about 5 months after the war started. First big victory, important victory for the United States. Midway. Now, here's where Japan, today maybe they wouldn't do it. Yes.
Where is Midway?
Midway is in the middle of the Pacific. That's where it gets the name Midway. It's in the middle of the Pacific, not far from the Hawaiian Islands. And the Japanese were going to take it before they came on and use it as a base of operations, fueling station, because those airplanes they had could not carry a bomb all the way across the Pacific. They had to have some refueling stations along the way. So they were going to take Midway and then use that as a launching pad to the United States. It did not work. Now, all of you maybe who know anything at all about Major League Baseball know that a team will win today and lose tomorrow. Even your World Series winners have lost 60 games. We get used to it, but the Japanese were not used to losing. So they took all those sailors from Midway, and instead of encouraging them, shelved them, put them in camps, prison camps, made slaves out of them, put them in work details. Terrible thing to do, and it can go out. Also, another thing, at the Battle of Pearl Harbor, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, their submarines got lost and did not contribute, so they shelled their submarines. Huge, huge mistake. In other words, if at first you don't succeed, you're fired mentality. Whereas we realize that sometimes even the best of people don't always succeed. If you don't succeed at first, try again. But their mentality, at first you don't succeed, you're fired. So right away they de-emphasized submarine warfare. Again, a big mistake. The people who had lost the Battle of Midway, they put aside, including, they executed a lot of the officers, the generals. That way every general knew that if he lost, he'd be executed. You might say, didn't this give them incentive to win? And it oftentimes made them just desperate and made them make moves that were desperate. Our generals took defeat after defeat, and we let them come back. Oh no, some of our generals, were retired, fired, or whatever, but not executed. Anyway, Midway was the first victory, and it somewhat turned the tide of the war. After the Battle of Midway, the Japanese were not to win another major battle for the rest of the war. But anyway, now back to Europe. Eisenhower joined forces with Montgomery. Montgomery felt like he should be the top in command. But Roosevelt said to Eisenhower, I'm going to make sure Churchill knows that you are in charge, because the Americans were putting out 4 times more than the British, and Montgomery finally had to accept that he was subordinate to Eisenhower. He obeyed orders reluctantly, but he finally accepted that Eisenhower was in charge. Eisenhower went into North Africa. He engaged the Germans under Rommel. At first it looked like the Germans were going to win, but Eisenhower managed to get some people on the move who didn't want to move, and he sent some of his top generals back to Washington in disgrace. But he turned things around and defeated the Germans in North Africa and drove General Rommel and his entire German army out of North Africa. And the British then got control of the oil fields of the Middle East again. They got control of their pipeline again. So the tide of the war was beginning to turn. Well, Eisenhower then invaded Sicily. And again, if you look on the map, I mean, Sicily is at Italy's toe, as you might say. Italy looks like a woman with a high-heeled shoe, and is said to be kicking Sicily. But anyway, Eisenhower invaded Sicily because Sicily was at that time under the control of Mussolini, and it was a surprise invasion. There's a movie called Ike, which I've had the privilege of seeing. I made a VHS recording of it, but that was more than 30 years ago, and today the recording is hopelessly degraded to where it can't be watched anymore. But anyway, the movie is still out though, called Ike, and it shows Ike giving to the press all the battle plans, but the press knew that if they revealed anything, they'd be sent to the electric chair. And one character who said, Ike's got them so afraid that they're afraid to go to sleep, afraid to reveal something in their sleep. But Ike finally just told the press, here's what we plan to do. The press kept it quiet. The attack on Sicily was a complete surprise. Basically, it was practice for the United States getting as close to the island of Sicily as they could, then the troops getting off the boat and wading up the beach. And this was what we used to do later in D-Day, getting off our boats and wading up the beaches. But the invasion of Sicily was a success. We drove the Italians and Germans out of Sicily. Next, Eisenhower then invaded Italy itself. The people of Italy welcomed the American troops as liberators. Make a long story short, the people of Italy eventually turned against Mussolini. And they executed Mussolini, and they treated him like an animal. Once they shot him dead and fired him and his mistress, they shot him dead and then hung him upside down by his heels. And they show a picture of him and his mistress being. Now his mistress, nobody in Italy hated his wife, Mussolini's wife. The mistress said, hey, listen now, the people around, we can help you escape. You don't have to put up with this. You don't have to die along with it. And nobody really hates you. We can get you free. She said, I want to die next to the man I love. So she got shot dead also and hung upside down also. So if you see pictures of it, you'll see the man and a woman, Mussolini and mistress. Hitler heard about this from his bunker. Anyway, Mussolini then gave up Ethiopia, gave up what it had gained from France, gave up all its territory that Germany had given it in Greece and Yugoslavia. And Italy switched sides in the war. But by this time, the war was almost over. Well, then after getting Italy on pretty much squared away, Eisenhower then went to England and waited for the right time to invade France from England. And it would cross the North Sea, cross the English Channel. But in the meantime, Hitler had put up his Atlantic Wall, which he said could not be penetrated. And we had to, the Atlantic Wall consisted of barbed wire fence. Now, again, any of you know anything at all about what we've had to face? Here's the water, here's the beach, and then there was a cliff. And then the Germans were behind the cliff with their barbed wire fences and trenches and tanks and whatever else, that any army that invaded would be exposed to what was shot at. But Eisenhower believed that we could do it, and we did. And I'm talking about Normandy Beach here. Now, in the meantime, Stalin became our friend. Stalin was one of the most evil dictators who ever lived. But sometimes, folk, you find yourself in a workplace situation where that you're forced to work alongside of somebody you just cannot stand. Stalin was really a bad friend. He was always complaining, "You're not doing enough. Or why don't you open a second front?" Hey, we were doing all we could. We were fighting the Japanese, which the Russians weren't doing, and we were fighting the Germans in North Africa and fighting them in Sicily and fighting them in Italy. So what more could we have done? But Stalin said, "No, open up a second front to take some pressure off of us." Eisenhower and the Allies decided, "Well, we'll open up a second front when we get ready to. We're not just going to open up a second front to please Stalin." Again, forced into a friendship with a man who doesn't share your worldview, doesn't share your values. It was a strained relationship at best, but nevertheless, it was workable. We always let Stalin knew when we were going to do something, and he in turn would let us know where his armies were, and that was something that you didn't have on the other side. Germany and Italy and Japan, those leaders would act without getting the approval of their buddies, their friends, you might say. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was done without Hitler's knowledge or Mussolini's knowledge. We did not do that. So we worked better with Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin worked better together than Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. Tojo was not the Japanese emperor's name. Tojo was the Japanese prime minister. Anyway, Ike waited for the right moment and decided, now we have to go. It's going to have to be sometime in June. We have to go when there's no moon out, so that only leaves 2 weeks, and we have to go when the weather is cooperative. We've only got a 2-week opening. If we wait too long, the cold weather will hit us and our troops will be caught out in the cold. So they chose a date, June 6, 1944, and folk, every June 6th you'll hear, June 6th was D-Day. D stood for the day. June 6th was the day, 1944. Now, the battle plan of the British and the Canadians, by the way, had joined the war. The British Canadians simply got off the ships, marched up the beach, and went. The American plan was more complicated. The American plan called for dropping a whole lot of bombs on France first, and dropping bombs on the beaches to make craters that would protect the troops. Now here's where this part of the plan went wrong. All the bombs they dropped were dropped on cow pastures and frightened a few cows. Did not do anything to them. Why was the bombing ineffective? Because the pilots could not see what they were doing. They had to bomb by instrument. Now today we could do it. Our instruments are much more accurate. But in those days, radar was in its infancy, not very accurate, so the pilots missed. The bombs fell on some cow pastures and did not make craters that would protect the troops coming off the boats. The troops, as they came off the boats, found themselves exposed, and that was a frightening disappointment. Nevertheless, some of them caught fire and began to march. I have a book at home called D-Day. It was written in 1956. Now, some of the troops then began to scale the cliffs, throw hand grenades in the German foxholes. One of them put a hand grenade to a mine to a fence, barbed wire fence, and blew an opening in the barbed wire fence wide enough for any ordinary man to get through. And slowly we got through. Now there were some places where the Germans drove us back. But all we needed along the line was a toehold. It's what they call a toehold. There were some places where that we drove the Germans back, particularly the Canadians and the British. They found places where there were no German soldiers. Why? Because the Germans had been sent to fight against the Russians to the east. So the British and Canadians had an easier time of it, just get off the ship and get inland. In the meantime, the people who, when the first ship dropped off its troops, the ships went back, picked up more troops. Then they went back and picked up more. The ships eventually learned what part of the line that we had already taken. So that meant the second and third wave could land, get on the beach, and get up top of the cliff without any interference, because we'd already taken that part of the area. Eventually, then the Germans were driven all the way off of the Atlantic Wall and deeper into France. And the Allies then began to liberate France one town at a time. Stalin finally got his way, then we had a second front opened, and this benefited Stalin because the Germans had to try to stop the Americans and British and Canadians, and the French began to rejoin the war. The French army, what was left of it, fled to Algeria and tried to reorganize from Algeria, but once France had been taken back, they got involved also, again. But mostly France was destroyed. All they could do was supply a few ground troops. All right. Now, when the Allies got to Paris, Hitler ordered, burn Paris. Burn it to the ground. I've read a detailed account. The order went first to one general, then another general took the day off, another general went on vacation, and the order finally found its way to a colonel's desk. The colonel chose to ignore it. Hitler asked his men, "Is Paris burning?" No. They finally had to tell him, because Hitler would have found out anyway. Hitler was very upset. "I've been betrayed, I told him to burn Paris." His general simply refused to do it. Eventually, American and British and Canadian French troops crossed the river into Germany. Something that never happened in World War I. Hitler told his people, "Now all of you have heard that the enemy has landed inside our borders, but you just wait, we have some super weapons, and we're going to drive them out." What super weapons are we talking about? Well, the Germans were working on the atomic bomb. They also had the V-2 rocket, the rocket to go 2,000 miles an hour, and nothing could stop it. Nothing. Now today we have missiles that could, but nothing could stop it. They had the V-2 rocket. They were working on the atomic bomb. They also were working on the world's first jet aircraft. But the problem is, if you put together anything, and I put together a lot of radios and other gadgets, most of the time they don't work when you first put them together. The jet aircraft did not work when it was first put together, and they had to get in and iron the bugs out of it. That took a year. By the time they got the first jet aircraft in the air, the war was practically over. And also, Allies blasted the runways to where they could hardly take off. Now, some of them did get off the ground, and they made life miserable for American pilots because the jet aircraft was faster, but they came into the war too late. Anyway, but Germany did have its super weapon. Now, about the V-2 rocket. I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Wernher von Braun was in charge. Wernher von Braun was a Nazi who had committed some atrocities, but as the enemy approached, he surrendered. And he and his men moved to the United States, and they helped the United States develop a rocket. And Wernher von Braun lived long enough to see America put men on the moon. In the meantime, Russia, the Soviet Union, was also grabbing up German scientists and taking them to Russia. And the United States was grabbing up German scientists. It became a famous saying among Americans. The Americans would say to the Russians, "Our German scientists are better than your German scientists," which might have been partly true. But these German scientists who went to the United States and Soviet Union wound up working like a fifth column, and they encouraged the United States to head towards socialism. Anyway, Wernher von Braun, I mentioned he was the most famous. If you had grown up when I did, you heard of him. Wernher von Braun finally died shortly after the first moon landing. And then they told us he had committed some atrocities as a Nazi. He was himself a full-fledged Nazi, and not every American trusted him, for I guess the best of reasons. Anyway, Hitler's super weapons did not save him. The Russians poured in from the east. The Americans and British and French and Canadians poured in from the west. Hitler's army could not do much, but they finally banded together and did one thing. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. Essentially, that was where the Germans banded together, and they scouted us and found that there was a few units that were ill-prepared. My father-in-law said some of them had even taken the cosmoline off their rifles. They put cosmoline's a metal preservative. The cosmoline was to keep the rifles from rusting. They hadn't even taken the cosmoline off the rifles. They were ill-prepared to fight. When the Germans hammered this weak spot in our defenses and bulged out, 70,000 Americans lost their lives. The Battle of the Bulge is the most, we lost more men in that battle than we did in any battle in our history, including all our Civil War battles. Some 70,000 soldiers, Americans, lost their lives, and the Germans would wear American uniform, pretend to be Americans, and infiltrate our ranks, and then start shooting and killing Americans. This was the way the Germans were fighting at the Battle of the Bulge. But the Americans rallied. Now, this is where General Patton played his biggest role. General Patton had gotten himself in trouble for kicking an American soldier who was suffering from what we might today call PTSD. He kicked a soldier and got a lot of bad press for it. And he was kind of put on the shelf for a while. Nevertheless, we felt like we needed him at this point. Patton was the tank commander. Now, the problem was when Patton heard that the Germans had broke through our defenses at the Battle of the Bulge, there was several feet of mud between him and the places where he needed his tanks to be, and the mud was going to keep him from moving his tanks out. So any of you can take this for whatever you want to. I mean, I'm going to tell it in raw format. I'm not going to try to explain what happened. Patton's weathermen said, forget it, there's not going to be a hard freeze. We have to have a hard freeze. Once we have a hard freeze, we can move our tanks out. We've got to have a hard freeze. The weatherman said, I'm sorry, Mr. Patton, but there's not going to be a hard freeze. Patton said, all right, call every minister, call every priest, even call the shamans, even call rabbis, everybody who's a religious person, and pray for a hard freeze. They did. That night, Germany went through 4 feet of unpredicted snow, but Patton had his hard freeze. His tanks now could move on the ground, and Patton's tanks moved to rescue what was left of the American army that had been driven back. He stopped the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge. They could not handle Patton and his tanks. Again, each of you can take that for whatever you wish, however you want to. Now, I'm going to digress from the actual progress of the war for a time and talk about the Holocaust. American troops eventually overran some Holocaust sites, as did the Russians. There's a story told that even battle-hardened American troops were moved to tears when they saw the condition. The people living inside the concentration camps were starved to the point of emaciation, to where they were human skeletons, neither dead nor alive. They had been beaten, they had been starved to the point where they had completely lost their minds. And they were only a shadow of their former selves. One book said neither dead nor alive. The story goes that there was a French town that did not know that the Holocaust camp was right nearby. The Americans told these people, not a friend of Germantown, the Americans told these Germans, you are all going to see this camp tomorrow. So they rounded them up, all the German citizens rounded them up. The Germans were, we're going to a picnic, so what's the big deal? They saw the condition of people living inside the concentration camps, and they left in complete tears, having had no idea of the suffering that was going on. just about a mile from where they lived. No idea. The next day, the mayor of the town and his wife committed suicide. Again, conditions there were undescribable. What was the reason? And now, keep in mind that Hitler killed 6 million Jews, but also he killed a higher percentage of gypsies than he did Jews. He also killed millions of persons who disagreed with him. All told, about 15 million people are believed to have died in the camps. Anyone he considered undesirable, the weak, the feeble, the feeble-minded, the dissenters, and the Jews and gypsies. 10 million of the forced laborers died of starvation, overwork, or shooting. But folk, later, some people around Hitler realized it was a mistake. When Hitler was running out of men. All right, it takes 150 men today to keep one soldier on the front lines in the battlefield. I mean, somebody has to grow his food, somebody has to make his uniform, somebody has to make his guns, somebody has to make his ammunition, and then somebody has to carry all this stuff. All told, this amounts to several persons. Well, Hitler's men, the men around him, Goebbels, Göring, later said, oh yeah, and Himmler, this was a sad waste, because if we'd have kept these people alive, 15 million people, if we could have kept them alive, fed them just enough to keep them alive, and worked them, they could have worked our factories, they could have supplied the war material. Instead, Germany was running out of factory workers, and at that point Hitler told Mussolini, we're going to make you Italians factory workers. Mussolini didn't like that a bit. But you Italians can become our factory workers, and we can have factory workers to supply the troops on the front lines. But it was a sad waste. The main reason, folks, I blame Charles Darwin a lot for the Holocaust. Racial inferiority, genetic inferiority, get rid of the weak, and the strong will survive and get stronger. The logic is bad. A lot of times a very weak papa will have a super strong son. It reminds me of something I saw in one of the original Star Trek movies. They said this man, they captured a man from the 20th century. They said, we don't need to return him. He made no significant contribution. But then Spock came and said, wait, we got to send him back. Why? His son was on the first expedition to Saturn. So this man has to go back. Anyway, survival of the fittest, all this, a mindset of racial superiority, Aryan superiority, all this had a lot to do with why Hitler elected to kill multiplied millions of people in the Holocaust. Now, in the meantime, there were persons who escaped, and they would try to tell the American press what was going on, and the press would not print it. They said, we hear all kinds of rumors, we can't print it. Franklin Roosevelt is said to have known about the Holocaust and did not really do anything about it. Well, maybe he did get us involved in the war. But again, it wasn't mostly Jews. Of 6 million Jews and 15 million altogether, that meant 9 million other people besides Jews. Germany, like Japan, treated the people it conquered very poorly. The Allies then began to bomb German cities. In April 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died. The new president was a man the country knew little about. Somebody like, who's that? The new president, Harry Truman. When Hitler heard that Roosevelt died, and this is ironic, that of all the World War II leaders, Roosevelt was the first one to die. But when Hitler heard Roosevelt had died, he was overjoyed. He thought that the United States would crumble. He did not understand we go by a system and not by a person. The next president was just as determined to defeat the Germans as was Roosevelt. The armies began closing in on Germany. Hitler went to his bunker. And as the Russians invaded and got into Berlin, the United States felt like, well, no, we're not going to go to Berlin. Now, this is going to become important later when we talk about post-war Europe. The United States generals met together and decided, should we go to Berlin? But then they realized there were military risks, and one risk was